Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. I am Peter Englert. I am one of the hosts of this show. I'm also with our producer, Dylan Carnival. And we are here with two special friends, Jill and Lee Teitsworth. The question that they are going to be responding to is, why doesn't time heal all wounds? And we'll be sharing a little bit more of that story later. But remember, Why God Why is brought to you by Browncroft Community Church. Just a little bit about Jill and Lee. Lee is, I like to say he's Lee Teitsworth Enterprises. He's a painter. He's a balloonist. He flies hot air balloons. He fixes up cars. He's just got quite a story. And then Jill is a ASL interpreter. They are also parents of 4 wonderful children, and we'll tell a little bit more about that story later. So we'll get started from there. Jill and Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I know. Jill said before the podcast, she's like, I can sign, I can sing, but I'm not a fan of talking.
Nope.
So, to get started, we're in this series about grief, and you all have a story to tell about that. And so I guess my question that we've been starting off with everybody is, what's your basic definition or understanding of grief?
This is the way, if we could boil down grief to a distilled definition, maybe the way we would think of it is a person's response to personal loss, some kind of loss. So that's kind of the way we frame it and think about it is that maybe immediate and ongoing response to some kind of a loss.
Jill, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this question and I don't know, I feel like it can be any kind of loss. It can be, we haven't had interaction for how long? It can be loss of interaction. It can be loss of a limb. It can be loss of a baby. It can be loss of a parent, or loss of a future. So, there's all sorts of different types of losses, or even like loss of what you had envisioned your future to be, just that changing. So
I really appreciate it. I think you're probably the first ones to add in a person's response. Most people have just said loss. So I really like that. And, the question that we picked for you was, why doesn't time heal all wounds? And when you hear time heal all wounds, what are the thoughts that you have?
To an extent, it's true, of course. As time goes on, some of the acute pain wanes, and it isn't as necessarily as sharp of a pain as time goes on. And yet, just like a physical wound, if it's not treated properly and it's not dealt with properly, it may not heal well. And even a wound that does heal well, whether it's emotional or whether it's physical, it may affect you for years to come. And in this case, when we're talking about grief, one thing that Jill really brought to light as we were in some discussion leading up to this is how all different kinds of things can trigger the memory of that loss, and it can trigger that grief. And it might happen a couple weeks later, certainly, when it's really fresh. It could be a year later. It could be years down the line. So although time does, in some sense, heal, in another sense, it can still be very fresh, even years later.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think I found that it's not far below the surface. So a song, or for me personally, when one of our hard times happened, seeing a pregnant woman rub her belly, and remembering what that felt like, and the fullness and everything, that would strike me. Or I don't know, there's a number of different things that just bring it to mind. I lost my mom 11 years ago, and so an ornament or a recipe with her handwriting, those things bring it to the surface where you're fine every day, and then all of a sudden you see these things, and it's like it was yesterday again, and it feels suffocating and almost chokes you again.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so glad you brought up your mom. So, like, why don't you walk through what you experienced with grief? And I think what we're finding with our guests, there's usually one thing that people can point to, but as you both have said, you experience grief in a lot of different ways. It's just becomes more acute. So, why don't you tell us about Clara and just your experience and, what happened?
Okay. Well, like you said with my mom, 11 years ago, she passed away out of the blue. We had been shopping the day before, and she died of a heart attack, essentially. She'd been diagnosed with cardiomyopathy. And so my oldest was 4 months old when she passed away. And then a handful of years later, we were pregnant with our third child, and we had the anatomy exam and everything. That happens usually around 20 weeks. Everything seemingly looked good. And then about 5 weeks later, we had to check something on her anatomy again. I don't think they got a good picture of her spine or something. And so we went back in, and when I was laying there, I was kind of peppy and asking the ultrasound tech questions and being like, what are you measuring? She's like, well, that's a femur. And then she paused, and I looked at her face, and she's like, I'm not finding a heartbeat. I'm going to go get the doctor. And so in my mind, I was like, well, they forgot to plug something in. Like, she's going to go get the doctor, and the doctor will plug that thing in, and everything will be okay. And the doctor came in, and she just all of a sudden had this she had this look of dread, and she was like, I'm so sorry. I was like, wait, but wait. I mean, you have to do something first. And so she just turned the ultrasound thing away and sat down and started talking to us about what had happened and what they knew had happened and next steps. And I was just reeling from confusion and trying to wrap my head around what she was telling me. And I remember the song, Lord, I Need You, God, I Need You, Every Hour I Need You, was going around in my head during that. And I know that I think that song particularly is talking about sin. But in that moment, it was just my prayer. I was just saying, Lord, I need you. I need you. And it was quite the process after that.
I never realized that you were in the doctor's office and just how sudden. Have you found that experience to be with a lot of couples, or women that it's, I walk in, I've heard some say, I felt like something wasn't right.
Well, I did feel like something wasn't right. The Friday beforehand, actually, I had an appointment, and the midwife checked me, and she did say that she was measuring small, and the baby was measuring small, and that she wanted to get me in for an emergency ultrasound, but it was Friday afternoon, and the emergency ultrasound was already taken. So I had to be scheduled on Monday morning at 11.
We heard the baby's heartbeat on that.
We heard the baby's heartbeat that day.
Appointment.
And she said, the midwife was like, oh, her heartbeat sounds strong, so we'll see on the ultrasound. And then I remember sitting in church on that Sunday and putting my hand on my stomach and feeling her kick. And I remember exactly where that feeling was. And I just looked at Lee, and I took it as she's okay, she's okay. But I still had this feeling of dread. I remember taking a walk and just praying to God and feeling like, I don't know, that something wasn't right, but hoping that it was just something that was like, maybe something was a little bit off physically, hoping that not that she was gone. So
Lee, so I mean, just to be real with everybody, I haven't gone to an appointment with my wife, and she's pregnant, at all because of the coronavirus. Which, I think you feel the responsibility. How did you find out? Were you at the doctor's appointment, or
Oh, because there was some apprehension leading up to it, and I went to a lot of the appointments with you, right?
especially ultrasounds.
Yeah, and so no, I was there. I was with her, and I'm the type of person who, I'll maybe minimize an issue and not think it's actually a big deal. So through the weekend, it wasn't that I was unsympathetic, but I just didn't think that anything was actually wrong. So I was caught very off guard, and I was caught off guard with how much it affected me. Because with pregnancy in particular, I've said it a lot of times, there's a reason they're 9 months long because you need that amount of time, just physically to prepare your space, but also mentally to believe that it's actually real, that it's happening. In the first probably 10 weeks, probably until I hear that first heartbeat at the appointment, it's almost like it's not even real. It's not even happening. And then you hear the heartbeat and it's a little bit real. And then, your wife starts to show a little bit. It's a little bit more real. So, we had, Jill had other miscarriages early on. And it's, we as Christians tend to hold to the scripture that, from your mother's womb, the Lord knew you. We believe that that's true. But there's a different level of reality of what's really happening as time goes on. And by 25 weeks, we had rearranged our home. We have a 3-bedroom house, and we had 2 kids at the time. And so we were rearranging our house to make space. We had just set up the crib. We had painted the room. We had really prepared the space. So the baby was coming, and it was finally real to me that the baby was coming. Whereas before that, it was very much real to Jill. She felt it, she felt the baby. She knew her body's changing and everything's changing. And to me, it was still abstract. But with a baby at 25 weeks, it really struck me in a way that I did not anticipate.
So, first of all, when you interview your friends, you find out more. So, how many miscarriages did you have before?
I had 2.
You had 2.
Yeah.
So first of all, this is what I would say to all of our listeners. If you haven't gone through a miscarriage, you know someone that has. Like, it's that common. It's just not talked about. Help us understand as a couple, maybe even individually, what's the difference of walking through a miscarriage versus what happened with Clara?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
It is a good question. I think Lee touched on a big part of it is just that, I don't know, I feel like you get past that 12, 14 week mark and you kind of feel like I'm smooth sailing now. Like I got past that mark. With my earlier miscarriages, they were, one was about 7 weeks, one was 8 weeks. And I feel like, although the 8-week one, I was pretty broken about that one. But it wasn't quite as real, although I had already envisioned my family with that baby because I had a couple weeks to think about and envision how this next baby would change our family. And so I was already dreaming, and I was already making space in my heart for this little one. So Clara, which is what we named her, medically speaking, from what I've read, after 20 weeks, it's considered a stillbirth. If a loss in the womb is considered a stillbirth. Where at 12 or so weeks, you probably will still need some type of medical intervention in order to remove the baby. You need even more so with a baby that's a pound or more. And there was a lot of physical stuff with this. It wasn't just the emotional heartache. It was
physical, medical.
Yeah, physical, medical stuff had to happen. And that was some of the challenge for us. We had actually had really close friends that had a stillbirth a couple years beforehand, right after we had our second child. And they're dear friends of ours. And so we kind of walked with them through that. And that was full term. And I don't know, it's just, I'm trying to put into words exactly how it's.
Well,
Yeah.
In some ways there isn't a difference, right? And we, but in a major way, we have another friend by associate. I don't know her real well, but she had a son who was older. How old was he? 3 years. Carrie said.
Oh.
Who passed away, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's living. He's running around, and I know living. It's a misnomer. You understand?
It was
what
a girl,
saying.
and she was 8 months old. So I'm just.
Oh, there you go.
Details.
The details of what I'm talking about.
Well,
yes.
and I just kind of want to encourage you, like, this is hard to talk about,
Right.
and I was even kind of thinking about, I said 4 kids in the beginning, and I was like, well, should I have said 5? And now I'm wondering, like, should I have said 7? So,
Right. So you wrestle with that, Peter.
You do.
That's why it's such a good question. It's one of those things that I think for listeners, we talked about this. This is one of the challenges. Well-meaning people see us in the grocery store, see Jill in the grocery store, and she's got 2 kids, and say, "Oh wow, you've got your hands full. How many kids do you have?" And it's a friendly question, and all of a sudden it grips your heart. Jill will not be able to answer and appear really rude because she has to turn her head so she can hide her tears. Like, well, how many do I have? Is it 2? Is it 3? And that's something that we had to wrestle with. How do we answer that question?
And I still wrestle with that question.
Right.
I mean, I would say that soon after we lost Clara, which was over 7 years now, that happened. But soon after, when I would be in the store with my older 2 kids, and someone would say that to me, and when they would say, "You've got your hands full," all I wanted to say back was, actually, my arms ache with how empty they are. I just want to hold my baby that I just lost. So yeah, then I would often say I had two kids. I had 3 kids. I have 2 kids on earth and 1 in heaven. And that's what I would say often. And honestly, even now, I still kind of bring that up every once in a while. Like, it depends on what mood I'm in, or I don't know what brings it up necessarily. But sometimes someone will be like, "Oh, how many kids do you have?" And it'll just be like the right moment or something. Sometimes I don't want to kind of broach the subject, so I just like, I've got 4 kids. But other times I'm like, I've got 4 on earth and 1 in heaven. But you're right. In truth, it's 3 in heaven, right? But somehow Clara having her footprints on my wall, it just made it more personal, I guess. And yeah.
So I guess I'm curious how you walk through this type of grief as a couple. And, not that we want to draw a Venn diagram who's watching this, but, there's certain aspects about grief that we all kind of go through. And then there's certain specific grief, so there's like specific grief to losing a child. And, one of the things that I've heard, we have a couple mutual friends that, I kind of heard this comment, which is, as a woman, you're holding this life in your body. And as a man, you're kind of, I mean, I can say this because I'm one, like, you're just there. Like, you're, you know, I'm kind of looking at my wife and like, hey, I love you. Do you need a back rub? Do you want me to get, but I don't have this life inside. Like, it's just different. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, you know, how have you both related in grief, and how have you both kind of said, we just didn't see this the same way, so to speak?
Well, I would say, first of all, because I had lost my mom before all of this happened, I was kind of maybe used to Lee being the one to hold me up and being the one to comfort me. And so when we were in that ultrasound room and the doctor left, and Lee and I kind of had to grapple with this and come to grips with this new reality. And the doctor left and I started sobbing. And then I heard someone else crying. And I opened my eyes and I saw Lee doubled over crying. And that was just like, oh, yeah, we're both in this. Like, we just both lost someone. Not that he didn't lose my mom too, but it just wasn't, this was his child, this was his baby. And so realizing that was quite surprising for me, and realizing that, like, oh, I need to support him too. Like, we're going to have to support each other through this. And because there was so many things medically I had to go through, I was on the phone a lot that day with midwives and doctors and all these different people and all these different opinions, and constantly on the phone. And so I was handling all the details. And I remember at one point I went into Lee's office to ask him a question, and I could see that there had been like some type of weight had been lifted slightly off of his shoulders. Like, you could see kind of a brightness in his face. And he was talking on the phone. And I kind of motioned to him, I probably signed to him, like, who was it? And it was Pastor Rob. And I can't tell you how comforting that was for me to see someone supporting him when I couldn't.
Mm.
And I mean, he had supported me already in so many ways, but I had to deal with all this other stuff, and just knowing that someone was reaching out to him and supporting him meant the world to me. So that was the first difference that I noticed. But I would say one of my favorite things about being pregnant is that I get to go everywhere with the baby. I get to take the baby with me to work, and I get to feel the hiccups while I'm working, and there's this personal connection.
Mm-hmm.
I can feel the little kicks and just feel that connection. And after losing her, one of the hardest things was just that emptiness that I felt, just the loneliness, that deep loneliness that no one else could fill. You know, I wanted her back. And I would say that, I'm trying to think which story to tell. I think right after, and I think many people do this, I felt like I needed to be in a different place emotionally than where I was at.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, I felt like I needed to move on. Like, this happened. Okay, now we had this trip planned. We're going to go on this trip. And like less than a week later, I had started this 3-part interview for a new job. And I had one part left, the third part, and I was just going to do it. I was going to get it done. And they were just kind of, I wasn't ready for these things and emotionally ready for these things. I was still in this fog of grief. And Lee, all he could really do is support me in them, because I don't know, do you have a better view of like how those things went?
The interview?
Huh?
The interview, you mean?
Well, yeah, you can do the interview if you want.
It didn't go well.
It didn't go well. He was watching me through the window, and it was just like, she's not doing well.
Yeah, no, I think what you're trying to say, right, is that sometimes we expect ourselves or each other to be in a different place in grief, like, than we really are.
Mm-hmm.
And referring back to I had the details completely wrong, but what our friend had when she had lost her 8-month-old,
Mm-hmm.
right, and you felt like you hadn't experienced as much pain as her, so you had
Right.
no right to grieve, or, like, in comparison to you, I really haven't had a loss.
Right.
My baby wasn't full term yet, and what she told to you, I don't know the word for word, but basically she said, look, your pain is your pain.
Your hurt is your hurt.
Your hurt is your hurt, and you need to grieve that pain.
Yeah, I was
And
just
that
actually
was-
talking to her today about that.
Really?
Yeah, I contacted her because
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to find out what she meant a little bit more, because in the grief moment when I met with her, I mean, she had lost her 8-month-old, and at that time her husband was in the process of passing away from brain cancer. So I wanted to talk with her, and she just said, yeah, your hurt is your hurt. You can't compare to other people. There is no scale of this pain, this circumstance hurts more than this circumstance. Your hurt is your hurt, and you need to let yourself grieve.
Mm.
And in about a month after I had Clara, I remember talking with her, and I kept just apologizing. Like, I'm so sorry. This doesn't even compare to what you're going through. It doesn't compare what you've gone through. And she just stopped me and she said, your hurt is your hurt. And I was actually able to do that soon after with another friend that had an earlier infant loss than I did. And she said, I can't imagine what you're going through. This probably seems so trivial. And I'm like, no, your hurt is your hurt, and you've got to let yourself grieve.
And can I interject? How did that affect you? I'm taking Peter's role here for a second. but
This is all
No,
good.
this is-
I know
This is
what
being Jill's husband.
I know what you're driving at, and it's a good point. How did that free you up?
It was freeing. It was totally freeing. It let me feel like I could just sit in my grief and be okay with that, because up until that point, I think I just kept trying to move on. And there was even a time at work where I was getting ready to interpret, and there was another interpreter who was very pregnant, and she rubbed her belly. And when I saw that, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't, all of the memories came flashing back and flooding back, and I just had to get out of there.
Mm.
And I ran out of the room and this was at RIT, so I went to RIT to where it used to be a bathroom. And it was no longer a bathroom, it was some poor person's office. And I ran out to that room, and then there was someone in there, so I ran to a different place, and there were people everywhere, and I ended up burying my face in a corner and falling on the ground sobbing. And I was shaking, and there were people, my colleagues, my clients surrounding me everywhere. And it was like a job fair situation. So there's people bustling everywhere. And I'm just hysterically crying.
How you said that was a month later?
No, it wasn't even a month later. It was about 2 weeks later. And someone came up that I knew, and she was like, "What's wrong, Jill?" And I was like, "There's a pregnant person in there, and I just gave birth to a stillbirth, and I can't breathe." And I was just falling apart.
Those were some difficult times, but it was freeing to know that you could grieve and feel your hurt, right?
And not expect myself to be somewhere where I wasn't.
Yeah.
So that kind of brought me back and let me grieve.
Mm. I kind of want to come back to, you said the fog of grief. At that point you had 2 little ones. How did you ever feel like the fog left, or, just, and I'm thinking about this as a family. I mean, you're talking about an experience at work that I think a lot of us can kind of relate to. And again, I love what your friend said, that your hurt's your hurt, and I think that there's a lot of people that can relate to it, because it's like you walk in, you think you get the promotion, you don't get it. And the next week, that person that got the promotion is like presenting, like, you may not, go through what you go through, but you're going through the same thing. I think about the coronavirus. We were going to go on that trip. It didn't happen. So I guess I'm just kind of curious how long, or even if you felt like the fog ever left kind of in your home.
That relates to your question that you asked earlier about how I'm sure people process differently. And because it wasn't in, this didn't happen within my body, I processed it differently. For me, it was about 2 weeks. And I'm not saying that within about 2 weeks after Jill delivered the baby, which required surgery, and it was a whole thing. I was able to function, pretty well. And it's not that it was gone, but I was able to function pretty close to 100% on my daily life after about 2 weeks. But in those 2 weeks, I was pretty wrecked, which I told you it surprised me. For Jill, it was much longer than that, and that did create some challenges in our relationship, because we were in different places and we processed things differently and we felt things differently. Jill anyway feels things much deeper than I do. She just does. It's a reality. But in this case in particular, of course, between the physical pain and the connection with the baby, it took her much longer, and for her to see me, function again was difficult for her, and it did create some conflict that we had to work through. So that was about how long it took me.
I think for me, when I lost my mom, I had people all around me that knew her. And so I could talk with them. I could talk with my sister or my dad or Lee even, and remember stories or anecdotes and quirky things that she used to do, and laugh or cry or feel things with each other. But with Clara, I couldn't share those memories with anyone. I couldn't say, hey, Lee, remember that one time she kicked? Like, I couldn't do things like that. And it just felt so lonely. And so when he started to move on 2 weeks later, I just felt like I was still drowning in this loneliness and in this emptiness. And I felt so confused why he could move on and I was still suffocating.
So you had 2 more kids, and human beings aren't necessarily the best. And even just what you said right there, you have people in your life that knew your mom, that even though they grieve differently, there's kind of the shared experience. Now all of a sudden you have 2 kids. People don't always know what to say. What were some things that people said that were helpful? And what were things that people might have said even now that weren't very helpful in the grieving process?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my thought is, if somebody is being genuine and sincere in what they say to you, I have a lot of grace for that. It's when people try to belittle what you're going through, when they try to compare it to somebody else's that's worse than yours. That's when I felt hurt. My friends and I have been talking a lot about grief right now, because I have a dear friend that's going through some horrific things. And she's struggling with when people tell her that they're praying for comfort and peace for her, and she's not feeling it. And I think that when you're not feeling that peace or that comfort, again, I think we expect ourselves to be farther along in our grief than we are. But also I think that feelings lag the answered prayers often, where we may pray for strength, and it is given, but Scripture says that it's in our weakness that His power is displayed and perfected. So we might not necessarily feel that strength that we've prayed for. We might not feel the peace, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And so I think with people, with me, being available at the drop of a hat, expressing their love for me, like simple things like that were the most comforting. Lee's dad did something early on that was incredibly comforting for both of us, and it was just not asking us, not telling us that he was going to do something, but he just.
Well, I can give a couple concrete examples. One, and I'm going to come back to that example in a second, but one thing that was tremendously helpful for me, I remember specifically in the receiving line after Jill's mom passed away, in the receiving line, someone from her church who had experienced the same thing I had, his wife had lost a parent early. He said, I sympathize. I know how hard this is going to be. It's never going to go away. I said, wow. It kind of floored me. I said, really? And that was a little discouraging. And I don't remember his exact words. It's not exactly how he said it. But I have noticed that in that case in particular, when it comes to the beginning of August, Jill's mood is going to change for the 2 weeks leading up to that. Something clicks, something about the weather, something about the angle of the sun, something about it. She feels it, and I need to be able to honor those emotions and just let her feel what she feels, recognize where it's coming from, and not get defensive. That's how I can support her in that, and schedule a date for that. Schedule a date.
He's learning.
The specific example with my dad, as you mentioned right at the beginning, I'm a hot air balloon pilot. My family flies hot air balloons, and every year we go to a balloon festival up in the Adirondacks in the fall, and it's very much a family thing. And Dad, he has his spot on the field where he goes to every year. He flies for a corporate balloon, and so it's a highly visible location. That's where he goes. Well, I that year was flying for someone else, and I was going to be located on the other side of the field. And when you've gone through loss like you do, it's very easy. Jill mentioned you can feel very, very lonely. And I remember feeling as isolated and lonely as I ever have in my life. It was less than a week later. It's the trip she mentioned earlier. And I just hated the idea of being based, having my family there. My family meaning my dad, my brother, my mom, nephews and nieces. They were all there, but on the other side of the field, and we were going to be completely isolated from them. So without announcing it to us, my dad, who had been in that spot for 10 years or 15 years or whatever it was, just quietly didn't go there, came over, set up the balloon next to us, and that meant that all weekend we were able to interact with my family instead of being isolated, and I can't tell you how much that meant to me. So it wasn't, in his case, what he said, it was what he did. Mm-hmm. So that was really, really significant for us.
You know, in going through this series, you know, the only way that I can really pick people to like be interviewed is people that talk about it. And, you know, there's other individuals that I could probably interview and they would probably say no, and I want to honor that. But, you know, something that I've just kind of noticed about both of you is like you honor your grief, even the way you're talking about it right now, like the beginning of August, I hear the balloon pilot come out. The sun's a certain way. I know I got to, and then, you know, even with you, Jill, like you just have a good handle of your emotions of like something isn't right. And you might not be able to put your finger on grief. So what advice would you give to people? You know, we're dealing with this question. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but like, how do you help people honor their grief, especially if they might not know that's what it is in the moment?
I'll take the first swing at that as well, because one thing that we set up in our relationship very early on, Jill and me, and one thing that I think it tends to be very difficult for us guys and not natural is I told her early on, she would feel uncomfortable and say, oh, I'm probably, I'm probably being irrational. I'm feeling, my feelings are irrational. I said, Jill, it's impossible for a feeling to be irrational. A feeling is a feeling.
So what I've loved about interviewing both of you is there's been this sense of honoring our grief. So knowing August is coming, the sun's the right way, balloonist right there. You even said there's some days I'm just upset. And I guess how would you guys know, how would you encourage people and recommend to honor your grief?
For us, it's been really important, and it's challenging as a guy to recognize and create this space in our marriage and our relationship. But I think it's really important that Jill feel free, both of us, but particularly her, to be able to be free to feel the emotions that you feel, to process through them, to discuss them, and for me to respect that. It's really easy to diminish emotions that you don't relate to and say, that's ridiculous, or it's irrational. But I told her really early on, there's no such thing as irrational emotions. Thoughts can be, you can put 2 and 2 and get 5, and that's, it's not right, it's not real, but you feel what you feel. And we've always, I think, done a pretty good job of being able to process through those things, and it creates a healthy environment for us to be able to just work through things. And once I hear what she's saying, and once she hears what I'm saying, then we can speak truth to each other. Mm-hmm. Truth is a really important component to this. Scripture is a really important component to this. And when we're able to be vulnerable in that way, and just honest with each other, no matter what, share our feelings with each other. I grew up as a farmer, and so it's like I grew up on a farm, so that's not the most natural thing, but it can be learned, and it's really important. So that's one way that we've learned to honor each other's grief, I think, if that answers the question.
Mm-hmm.
I saw, I don't know, I think it was on Instagram or something, but there was this little meme. I don't know if it's a meme, but it's a little inspirational quote. But it was something along the lines of, it's important to honor our feelings, not worship them. Mm. And I think that's so true. I think it's so important to feel what we're feeling and to not assume that we should be feeling something different than what we're feeling. Whatever your response is from a loss, that is your grief. That is your hurt, and feel it. It's when you wallow in that grief forever later. And yes, it comes in waves, but I don't know. The Lord wants us to cast our cares on him. And I think this was in a sermon not too long ago. It may have been by you.
Uh-oh.
But how the act of casting isn't just like tossing, or it's not setting down. It's throwing it and casting our cares onto the Lord, and because he cares for us. And when we can do that, feel our grief and then cast it to him, I think there's so much healing in that.
Mm. Man, we could probably go on for 5 hours. Some real coffee. I want to close with, like we do all the time, what does Jesus have to say about time healing all wounds? So the good news is, so I start, and then pretty much I ask every guest to clear up the heresy or the ways that I've messed things up. And so I'll get started. What does Jesus have to say? And I'm just reflecting a lot on, you said that Clara would have been around 7 years old right now, and, your mom died 11 years ago, and you're still you're still talking about this grief. And I think there is a sense, yeah, time does heal all wounds, but there's also a sense that you're still going to feel it. And so I guess where I'm at, I think there's a ton of these pregnancy stories in the Bible. And recently we're about to, we're in a series right now with this recording about Abraham. And like Sarah laughs, and because the angel says, you're going to get pregnant. And it's been like 90 years of nothing. And you just see characters in the Bible go through that. And in Isaiah 53, it talks about Jesus he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquity. And I think when it comes to grief and sadness, Jesus never promises it won't happen, but there is something of absorbing it and taking it in. And, I'm thinking about the friend that you mentioned too, that, we're praying for comfort, you don't have it. Like, sometimes you're so in the middle of grief and pain that you're not going to feel comfort, and like you just have to give yourself grace. And I'm leaving this conversation. We talk about giving others grace all the time, and it's almost new agey, but I'm hearing from both of you, and I'm leaving with, what makes this conversation different is just the grace you need to give yourself. There's going to be days you don't want to get out of bed. There's going to be days, you don't want to do this, and to be able to acknowledge that, I think, is what's powerful. So
yes, and that another way of saying it may be accept grace from God, accept grace from those who love you, even as long as it's usually it's well intentioned. It might be fumbling, but as someone who to anyone supporting others who may be grieving, Jesus says, when someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. And guess what? If someone is grieving, they might lash out at you. You need to be willing to take that shot and not return the blow, but take it and reach your hands wide and be willing to give a hug, because that's probably what that person needs. And King David also had something to say in addition to Jesus. And this is the thing that in the hospital room, when we came in and Jill had gone through a procedure, and I went in and saw Clara's footprints on the table, and I was shocked. I didn't expect it, and it made it all the more real to me. We asked Pastor Rob, what can you say about, like, where is she? I know that I wanted to say, I think she's in heaven. And he pointed us to the scripture where David had lost his son, and he had been praying and fasting, covered himself in ashes for days and mourning. And then the baby died. And he said, he got up, he ate some food, he cleaned himself up. And he said, everyone wondered why. And he said, he will not come back to me, but I will go to him, meaning that baby was in heaven ahead of him. That was such a comfort for me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have much more to say because that was my moment too. So yeah.
Jill and Lee, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful podcast. You can find us at hashtag WGW podcast, whygodwhypodcast.com. I ask you to post on social media, but this is one you probably want to text or share with a friend. And also too, you don't know. And probably as you listen to this and share this, you'll find out people that have experienced what Jill and Lee have. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, glad to have you. And bye-bye.